Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at Joint Special Operations University. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including an audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and the opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Thank you.
Articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the Strategic Studies Department page through our library page, the All Partner Access Network, and JSOU social media sites. Today, Major Travis Clemens, an active duty civil affairs officer currently serving from a forward deployed location, joins us to discuss his recently published JSOU monograph entitled Special Operations Forces Civil Affairs in Great Power Competition. And here's a copy. He holds a master's degree in defense analysis with a specialization on special forces and irregular warfare from the Naval Postgraduate School and a bachelor's degree in engineering from California Polytechnic State University. He has had multiple SOF and conventional forces deployments, including Iraq, Senegal, Niger, and Chad, and has worked through the greater SOF enterprise with Naval Special Warfare, the Army Green Berets, and Marine Special Operations teams. So Travis, considering that you're 10 hours ahead, I will say good evening. Congratulations on the publication of your monograph, and thank you for joining us while you're serving downrange.
Hey, thank you, Kerry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so first off, I'd like to set the backdrop for our discussion today before we get into your monograph. So I believe everyone in the SOF enterprise is well aware of the robust discussion within the SOCOM headquarters, the TSOCs, Global SOF, and the academic institutions we regularly engage with about addressing capability gaps in the pivot to great power competition, especially after 20 years of counterterrorism and coin-centric operations in the CENTCOM EOR. So your monograph specifically addresses one of many core SOF capabilities, civil affairs, and you argue that it will figure more prominently in the future international environment. So before we delve into the meat of your monograph, however, I'd like you to provide for us your definition of the current international environment and address how SOF civil affairs has been utilized in the recent past.
Sure. So the current environment, I spent a lot of time on the monograph talking about, but really in the last 20 years, everybody knows we've been in this kind of CT realm, this coin environment, and kind of lost sight of really what most often the international environment is, which is this constant competition between various great powers vying for their own goals, their own policies, their own objectives in some realm where they have whether it's a shortage or there's just a finite supply of some resource that they're competing for, and that resource could be influenced or against other people, influence in target population, or hard resources like materials. History goes back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, and so that was part of what spurred this with all the literature and the move towards great power competition from a policy standpoint. Really is understanding there's nothing new under the sun, but there is a modern take to the environment now. And that is something that we have not really utilized SOF CA to really engage with up until this point.
So in your introduction, you go into a lot of detail about your research methodology and the factors that guided your analysis. Could you provide the audience an overview of that and how you assess the competitive environment involving China and Russia today?
Yeah, so when I approached this from an academic standpoint, the foundation of this monograph was my thesis. And a lot of times, people take the case study approach, or go look through historical case studies, pick out parts that apply now, put it all together into a final form, and hopefully learn something new from that. And what I realized very, very quickly is you couldn't really do this. When we're talking about soft civil affairs, it's a fairly new capability, right? Within the U.S. Army, it's organizationally, institutionally only been around since 2006, 2007. Civil affairs as a whole has been around longer, but as a soft component in its modern incantation is only about 13 years old. And so there really wasn't much historics that I could look into to say that this is how we apply this new capability. So instead, I had to take the plane in flight concept of looking at what do we have now in terms of capabilities as I define them later, which is doctrine, organization, training, and equipment. How do we have that arranged? And then what does that conglomeration, what sort of capabilities does it give the organization? And how do we use that going forward? And so I did this through interviews with the CA community, the SOF community, down in SOCOM with folks, and then a very long deep dive into CA history, CA doctrine, SOF concepts and doctrine, and then bringing that all together to just understand what the capabilities are that we have, and in order to start building a picture of how do we use them. And then the second piece of that is capabilities are fine and great, but you need an environment in which to compare them against. And this goes back to why I really couldn't use historic case studies, because the international environment today is very, very different than it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So a lot of the capabilities we may have now may apply great back then, or they may not apply at all. And so we really don't get a good analysis out of it. So I had to be able to analyze the modern competitive environment in order to provide that framework to really test those capabilities and the roles as I developed them against. So to do this, I found a great publication by RAND, written by Michael Mazar and a team, where they essentially developed a framework to understand modern great power competition. And in Mazar's work, they came up with 5 questions. The first 3 really of what was applicable to my research. And if you follow it, answer these questions and the sub-questions built into it, you get a pretty good understanding of the international competitive environment. And so that was the framework I used. And the 3 questions that I tried to answer applied against, in this case, Russia and China for obvious reasons, was, what is their essential character, which really goes into a lot of national identity stuff, history when it comes to like the international environment, and understanding some of the past scars, if you will, that really help define how governments behave and how they respond to changing situations or events. Because if you don't understand that history, that past, and how it affects decision-making now, you're missing out on a lot of understanding really of how do you affect these governments, because that's in the end what you're trying to do in the competitive environment. The second piece then is, what do they compete for? These are those resources, whether it's tangible or intangible. You have to know what they're competing for, because if China, for example, is competing for something that we have no interest in as the US, well, then there's really no competition. And so you have to find where those friction points are, where one country is competing for the same or in the same environment that the US is competing, to understand where do we need to apply resources, and then does SOF CA have a role within that specific environment? And then finally, the third question that was really relevant to my research was, how do they compete? This is where you get into the nuts and bolts of what strategies are they applying, what sort of resources or capabilities do they use in these environments where there is friction points, where there's competition between 2 nation states, because that determines really, when you get down to it, are the capabilities of SOF CA appropriate? Are they feasible to be applied in that situation? And is there any likelihood of the U.S. actually getting what it wants out of those capabilities?
Okay, so to sort of summarize the first 2 questions, the same principles that apply throughout history. You have to engage human populations. There's civil-military relations. You got to leverage support in the population, and we can take the best of those principles and then try to adapt them to the new operating environment. So my third question is, in chapters 1 and 2, you go into considerable detail about how civil affairs plays a vital role in 3 major joint concept documents that were published in 2016. You also address, and this is a really interesting learning point for me, the dynamic tension between conventional CA and soft CA. That's something I wasn't aware of prior to reading your monograph, and how that plays out in a lack of a defined role for soft CA within the realm of great power competition. So the question I have for you is, or actually more of a comment, if you could comment on this, would you elaborate on the role of CA within these joint concepts, and also discuss how soft CA can be effectively employed in the future competitive environment?
Sure. So a big part touching on the kind of the tension between conventional civil affairs forces and soft civil affairs forces. It is something that's vague in doctrine, although it's getting better. And what it really came down to, this is what drove the framework of how I analyzed what do we mean by capability. A lot of times we'll talk about, a unit has a capability. When you talk about an armor unit, it's pretty obvious. An armor unit's capabilities, it's tanks. When you talk about a mortar platoon, it's pretty obvious. A truck company, it's pretty obvious. Those capabilities are generally driven by the equipment which they have. But in civil affairs, we're not equipment driven. We don't have a lot of specialty equipment. Vehicles we use is whatever we need in theater. Communications equipment is basic communications equipment. So really what I found defines our capabilities is that doctrine, organization, and training piece. Organizationally, the difference between soft and conventional CA is pretty minimal. How we organize teams, it's a 4-person team. Companies and battalions, it's all fairly similar with a very little difference. Doctrine is starting to catch up to the differences that we see in the missions that we apply the resources to. But a big part of it really comes down to training in that. And what really drives our training in the soft CA world is the environments in which we are applied against. And so it was that's really, when you get down to it, that's the biggest difference between conventional CA and soft CA, is just the environments in which we apply the resources and those capabilities. And then that environment then is going to drive your doctrine, organization, and training in kind of a feedback loop. And so how the role of CA kind of fits into the joint concepts. So a really deep dive, the 3 joint concepts, the joint concept on integrated campaigning, operating the information environment, and HAMO, the human effects and human activities in military operations. And right, so the HAMO really, it makes sense how CA has a role in the human domain of military operations. That's what we're here for. The one very good point I thought that the JSOU HAMO brings out is it focuses on actors and influencing those actors. It's very almost Claus Wittgenstein in that way of who are the key actors that really are decision makers or the influencers within the organization that your enemy consists of, and then how do you influence those actors, which is exactly how within soft CA, that's how we look at our mission, is who are our key influencers or actors, those key individuals, those key leaders, and then how do we influence them, to get toward our objective. Kind of layering on top of that is the JSOU OIE operating in the information environment. And this joint concept really delves into what it defines as information, which when you boil it down, really, it's kind of 2 things that the JSOU OIE talks about. It's propaganda, disinformation, deception, that realm of the information environment, and then intelligence and information analysis. And so we look at that from a CA role, like that's our analytics side, but it's also the deception, disinformation, and propaganda side. That's the influencing an actor to do take a certain action or make a certain decision to get what we want. And then the joint concept on integrated campaigning, I thought was a really, really good step. And I think it's finally acknowledging a lot of the missteps in the past, where we look at, 1 year rotation in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then we fight that war again the next year with the next unit. Or we say we're going to go and we're going to do this discrete campaign or task, and then once it's done, we're leaving. Whatever happens before, what happens after doesn't really matter, because military, we're just looking at this one set of time. We're going to go in, we're going to do it, we're going to leave. And the JCIC acknowledges that you can't really do that in the modern environment. And so it really pushes on the idea of campaigning vice campaigns, where it's a constant, a constant struggle, a constant series of operations that aren't to get you to a certain end state, but to get you or to get U.S. policy towards certain conditions within the environment. We're looking for these conditions, but then it's a continuing campaign. You're not just stopping there, packing up and leaving. And so those three concepts, when you roll them up together, really mesh with how we use CA now, how we need to use SOF CA in the future, and that we're focusing on actors and influencing, using the information environment to do so in a ongoing campaign construct that doesn't just end, but we're continuing to push the ball forward and forward down the road. And then, once again, this is kind of that plane in flight concept of, we've had this capability, and within the active duty force, SOF CA has been around for 13, 14 years. So like, we've built up quite a bit to this point. So understanding where we're at now, and then doing that analysis on those capabilities, on that doctrine, on the organization, on the training and the equipment of where we are now. What is this, using the plane analogy further, what does this plane have? What are the engines like? What are the wings like? What's the the fuel capacity, the range, the communications, all that stuff, knowing what it can be best used for, and then identifying those roles based on that, and how do we use them. And so the four roles that I really identified, really it's four roles kind of split down the middle. The first two focus more on the reconnaissance piece, being a sensor, and the second two more on the engaging a population and influencing people to take certain actions that support U.S. policy. So the first role is that initial entry. We do this already. So SOF CA team's 4-person team, very, very small footprint, diplomatically, a lot lower risk. And so oftentimes these are the guys that we can use to gain initial entry into a country, build the relationships with the U.S. country team, set the conditions for follow-on forces, whether that's conventional or soft forces, because the civil reconnaissance aspect of understanding just the environment that is in that country. What are the roads capable of doing? Where are the airfields? What are the capabilities of the airfields? These are all common CA tasks, but it's really applied in that environment, which requires a little bit more sensitivities. It's also building relationships with that host nation, for example. Are they willing to accept U.S. support, maybe U.S. training if you're going to bring in an SFODA, anything along those lines. It's identifying who the key actors, going back to the JC HAMA, who are the key actors in that environment, passing it back and setting those conditions for follow-on forces, for whatever mission that might be. The initial entry piece is also something we commonly use SOF CA for, which is that access and placement. Being able to get access to people and build relationships so that, whether it's in a lot of cases, Department of State can't get out to places because they're just the higher risk than Department of State is willing to accept, but we can do that. And so that's that initial entry into a new area to support other U.S. government activities. The second role is reconnaissance. Civil reconnaissance is a key, a core task of CA. It's probably the thing we do most. But I didn't really narrow this down to just civil reconnaissance because it's a little bit broader than that. It's providing the reconnaissance through generally the civil domain of capabilities of key actors as part of that broader campaign. This is nothing new to anybody that's worked with CA conventional or soft. This is the meat and potatoes of what we do every day, but it's applying it in the great power competition realm. We can get into kind of some examples a little bit later on when we start understanding the environment which I applied this against. But that's 90% of the time probably what SOF CA is going to be doing. And so it's really leaning into that role, the role of like cavalry in a conventional unit, fighting for information, gain and maintain contact, right? The basic understanding of reconnaissance is something that really needs to be applied, and that's I argue in the monograph is as a force, SOF CA needs to lean into that and accept that is part of our identity. The third role is engage and influence, and this really in the great power environment, the competitive environment, I broke it down into three kind of sub roles. This isn't to say any of the engage and influence activities we take as part of counterterrorism or counterinsurgency don't apply. Those all definitely do. But for the sake of the monograph, I kept the scope to just the roles and how we should apply them within a great power environment. And so that's three real subtasks. It's inoculation, countering, and mobilize. So inoculation, right? I think everybody kind of understands now in the social media environment that you're not going to convince anybody of something they're already convinced, against something they're already convinced of, without a lot of resources, a lot of work, and a lot of personal, constant, regular contact in a way that specific person responds to. And so this is the same thing with propaganda or misinformation, disinformation from an enemy. So if you're not going to convince somebody of something that they've already heard, right? So when you're talking with people, it's psychology, and the psychology of primacy is very, very strong. The first message somebody hears, they're probably going to believe over the next message that is counter to that. So what can you do? Well, you can inoculate a population or people. You can show them, either how information comes across, that even that somebody is trying to deceive them or present, false information to them. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of things are starting to show, right? Because that's getting that primacy in where you're giving them the first information of watch out for what you're being told. And that can have a lot of positive effects when it comes to countering an adversary's information operation. If you can just get to the population first and inoculate them against it, you'll have a lot better success rather than trying to get there afterwards and change your minds. You're really probably not going to be able to. And this goes back into that reconnaissance piece of, it's not just trying to inoculate an entire region or entire country or anything like that. It's the key influencers. The key populations are the vulnerable populations based on the analysis of who do we need to inoculate. And that's through that reconnaissance piece of understanding what the environment is, who's the at-risk population. That's not just at risk, but also that is strategically important based on what the campaign is. If you're not able to get somewhere to inoculate them, or you fail to for one reason or another, the second role under the engage and influence piece really is countering an enemy information operation or disinformation. Now, this isn't to say, just give them information that is counter to what they're being told, right? Because we know that's not going to work. Instead, it's countering the effects. So, for example, if an adversary, is trying to get a population to not vote, for example, something kind of see with in Eastern Europe and with Russian propaganda, if there's a policy that they don't want and, there's a vote coming up, they're trying to get people not to vote. So you counter the effects of that enemy information operation by, for example, breaking down the barriers to voting. Normal civil outreach projects that we do all the time help and support voting, polling stations, helping the host nation provide transportation for people to go vote, right? Taking actions that counter the effect that the adversary is trying to get at. And that through these type of civil engagements, that's how you can counter an adversary's information operations or or different disinformation that is trying to get a population to behave in a certain way. And then the third part of the engaging influence is mobilizing a population. And that's where the influence piece really ramps up. And that's getting a population to, actively do something that's positive towards U.S. policy, and probably against an adversary policy in that case. This kind of flows into the fourth and last role that I identified, which is the support to resistance. And it's not just unconventional warfare, although a lot of the concepts are very similar, but it's more the broader concept of support to resistance. And that's really to do one of three things, and it's to deter an adversary. For example, if you're trying to prevent an adversary's armed conflict or military action on the ground, changing the calculus of their risk through a well-resourced, well-informed, well-organized resistance element changes the risk factor. There was a RAND study done a few years ago where they war gamed how long it would take Russia to through a military action to take over the Baltic states. And I'm going off memory here, but I think it was like about 36 hours that Russia could flow tanks up and take the Baltic states. Were that an action that Russia would take, it's probably based on certain assumptions of the feasibility of holding that ground. And if you can change those assumptions, you can deter that enemy potentially from taking those actions. The second piece of that is resistance, right? And so that's still goes into that support to resistance of a well-organized and resilient civil governance structure, whether it's the official government structure or an unofficial government structure that provides support for its people, continues information flow despite your adversary's information activities, also makes it difficult for the adversary to control that population, because you can push information in these areas, you can continue to just keep their spirits up, through an organized resistance, which degrades an adversary's ability to hold ground. They have to apply more resources to it. And so it's that kind of strategic look at degrading an enemy's capability in a territory they already control. And the third piece, which is probably going to be the most common in the competitive environment, really is undermining. And this is probably what I would expect to see most often when it comes to support and resistance. And it's undermining enemies or an adversary's goals and activities in a contested or competitive environment. So in a third country that's sovereign, hasn't been taken over yet, or may not ever be overrun in any way, but it's using the civil networks to undermine the goals of that host nation. For example, the People's Republic of China wants to build a port in a city or in a coastal city in a country. And this port is probably in a good place for potential future PLA Navy use, whether it's refueling station, any sort of intelligence collection station, anything like that. Just by its location, maybe pretty obvious that's what is very likely to be used for. Through SOF CA activities with that host nation, you can, in a completely above board manner, cause problems to the construction of that facility. It's working with the host nation government structures for licensing, permits, authorities to build, and ensuring that they have all the information to them, so they can make an informed decision of what this facility will be used for. It's also potentially link them up with the U.S. State Department to find alternatives to, in this fictional case, to a Chinese company developing it. It also could be something as simple as providing a third-party translation service for the contract, so you get a third set of eyes on it. So you don't have secret contracts between host nation and PRC or the Chinese company that nobody else knows about, which is a common tactic we see that China takes in a lot of their dealings. And just by exposing these contracts to the light of day, gives these host nations a little bit more leverage to negotiate for their sovereignty and not have certain parts of the contract actually make it to the final version. And this can be all done through SOF CA activities, through teams on the ground, or company headquarters at the higher level engagement, working with these host nations for these populations against an adversary and forward U.S. policy.
Okay, so as a former military planner in the Army, based on what you said, I think planners at the joint level should take heed of the critical role of civil affairs, make sure it's integrated into campaign plans, especially in terms of interagency support and developing measures of effectiveness and measures of performance. I mean, would you agree? Just my own observation.
Yeah, and that's one of the key points. It's one of the key points I try to get at is this has to be, and it's kind of it's an assumption I made at the front end of my research and of my recommendations, is all these activities, these roles, these 4 roles for SOF CA and Great Power Competition are predicated on the idea that they are part of a broader campaign that is planned out and delivered. Not a single team going to a country being told, go do CA stuff, figure it out, we'll let you know what you're doing right. That's not the way that you're going to get these sorts of activities and these sorts of results. If you do that, it's going to be very deliberate of, CA team X, you're going to this country to do initial entry and reconnaissance to achieve these goals as part of the broader campaign. Because if you don't have that level of fidelity on just the orders, it's just teams out doing stuff and they're doing their best, but they don't have that broader understanding of what they're there for. And that's a common thing we see with a lot of deployed CA units. So
to use an artist analogy, more Michelangelo, less Van Gogh, right? Nothing at the abstract level we want to see. Okay, so not that I'm an art critic or anything. So let's get down to the weeds about Russia and China. In chapters 3 and 4, you address the essential national character of China and Russia, and the basis and the nature of the historic clash between them and the USA. Because Russia and China aren't necessarily friends. You can readily ascertain that from studying history. And their current activities against our national interests. So my question is threefold. What is similar and dissimilar about China and Russia's strategy and capabilities in the current competitive environment? 2, where does SOF CA fit in our strategy to counter their malign influence? And 3, what are their likely courses of action in the future?
So this goes into really that background of what Mazar said was what is the essential idea of the country? What is, in their essential character? And distilling it down to, just a few minutes, 10,000 years of history in a couple of minutes. Russia and China had very different histories that led them where they are today. As you understand those histories and how they affected where the countries are now, it makes sense the actions that they're taking and why there's some similarities, probably more along the lines of just what works within today's environment versus what these countries would take, actions they would take given an unconstrained environment. And the big change, in today's environment versus more than 70 years ago is nuclear weapons, of course. And so nuclear weapons really constrains the activities of an adversary, because the risk and the danger of any sort of nuclear conflict is so great that countries, as we've seen over the last 70 years, as we saw in the Cold War, countries will constrain themselves to avoid that. Therefore, certain other strategies become viable because they tend to result in less escalation or in some cases, no escalation at all, at least historically. And so when you look at the history of China, right? You really had to understand the last, 3, 4, 5,000 years of their history of isolated geographically from the West for the most part, even though continentally they're still not far from Russia, for example. But mountains and deserts can be as big as oceans, especially in the ancient world, when it comes to trying to get across them. And so you had China that developed fairly independently, and really engendered the sense of the Middle Kingdom, or all under heaven, our common term you hear when Chinese referring to the home country or the history, the historic kingdoms. But that was all really cut short in what they refer to now as the century of humiliation. And that 100 years roughly between the opening of China forcefully by Western colonial powers and the Chinese Communist Party taking power in 1949 plays into a lot of their just national narrative and national identity now, and that affects how they're behaving now. You see this desire to go back to greatness, this historic narrative of China was the center of the center of the world, center of the universe, and so that's where they need to get back to. This was just a historic blip on the radar, and that they're going back to the way things should be, essentially, and that drives their goals. Whereas when you look at Russia, you had the Tsarist Empire for hundreds of years. Similar in concept, where the Tsarist Empire fell, communists came into power, and then communism fell. And so now, much like China, there's this sense of trying to get back to the greatness that was. But the way they're approaching it is very, very different. We see China approaching the competitive environment in a much more economic way. Part of it is because they're a rising economic power. Everybody knows this. They have the capability of applying economic resources across the world in the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Whereas Russia doesn't have that economic base to fall upon. So you see a lot more effort put into the information environment, the subversive elements, the lower cost construction projects, applying pressure with the little bit of economic power they have, which is petrochemical economics, especially in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And so those are kind of the main ways in which Russia and China try to apply their strengths as a country against other countries and against the U.S. But it's all based on and driven by their histories, as not just as an individual country but really as an identity of a country or of a nation. And then when events happen, you can see this in how they respond to it. You'll see the PRC will demand apologies for example, the EP3 crash 10, 15 years ago of the U.S. surveillance reconnaissance plane that crashed into a Chinese fighter. They demanded an apology for it. This goes back to that sense of being wounded by the West, or the century of humiliation. But it also is something that the Chinese use very, very strongly that Russia really can't as much, in that the Chinese government has since the Tiananmen Square, Desert Storm, and the fall of the Soviet Union, 3 events in really rapid succession, a year and a half, 2 years, that shook the CCP to its core. They responded to that by instilling a very strong education program of where they really hammer in this idea of the century of humiliation, that the West put us down, for example. And now what it has turn to 30 years later is an entire generation raised on this concept that is now out in the world. And now the CCP can leverage these Chinese citizens that are out all over the world to create effects in foreign countries, which is a very powerful capability that very few other countries really have. And the CCP considers in most cases that any Chinese-born person, whether a citizen, legally what we consider a citizen or not, still, is still Chinese and is still subject to the CCP. And that's where you get a lot of these information operations campaigns, the Confucius Institutes, the protests, for example, in Southern California. I think it was San Diego, but it might have been LA. A few years ago, the University of California down there invited the Dalai Lama to speak at a graduation commencement. The Chinese Student Association, which was organized through the local Chinese consulate and funded, set up big protests against that, against having the Dalai Lama come and speak at this, college graduation. And so the school eventually canceled the invitation to the Dalai Lama and acquiesced to that pressure. And then you see this all over the world where there are clusters of Chinese population in foreign countries that the CCP still exerts leverage over. In most cases, they're still Chinese citizens, but in many cases, they're not, but they're still pressured through the mechanisms available to governments to behave in a certain way that supports Chinese policy. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't really have this ability. They don't have that strong sense of Russian identity that's strong enough, at least, to get people to behave in that way and to accept that control from a foreign power. But they also just don't have that economic expansion and going out into the world that the PRC, the modern PRC, is going through right now, to give them the large population. They just don't have the population as well. And so that's why you see, once again, going back to Russia, Russia is very opportunistic in the activities they take. The attack on Georgia in 2008 in South Ossetia was a very opportunistic taking of land grab. Crimea, cyber attacks against Western countries are all based on, something happens that they have the opportunity and they're very quick to jump on it. But it's not necessarily part of a broader campaign other than just sowing discord and causing problems. Because Russia's strategy isn't so much to, at least based on the research I did and what I found, it's not so much to bring themselves up to be on top of the international pecking order, but to level the playing field by bringing everybody else down. And so that's what you see with their activities. And so when you get into how does SOF CA fit into the U.S. strategy to counter these or take actions that support U.S. policy in this environment, that's really where we start applying those roles. One is the access. Civil affairs teams within the SOF community, and even within Department of State communities, and in countries where it's politically sensitive or it's dangerous, higher risk, of any sort, they are more able to get into these areas. They're more able to move around these areas generally freely. And so it's just being those eyes on the ground. You don't necessarily need to counter Russian, information operations, but just being there to know what's happening. If we know that Russia is applying a lot of information operations in an Eastern European country, for example, that provides policymakers and it provides the GCCs with some advance warning of what may be happening. In Eastern Europe, if we know that the Night Wolves, a Russian motorcycle gang that is dispatched by Putin himself, if we know they're in a country or in a specific town or region, that is something a SOF CA team could very easily observe just through the normal activities or learn about. And so it's just providing that initial warning to actions that are being taken. And then you can go back into the engage and influence piece, countering populations against information operations, whether it's Chinese information operations or Russian. There's a vast amount of diaspora populations of Chinese-born people throughout the world who left, as workers for companies that were building in these countries and stayed for various reasons. Those populations are probably your vulnerable populations for basic civil engagement, and that takes that tool away from China if they're less willing to support them or less willing to work in the interest of the CCP. That takes that tool away from them. And then really going into the future. So what is China and Russia kind of looking at, big picture of the future? When I first started this project about 2 years ago, the international environment was a lot more stable, I'd say, than it seems now. So if you look at the historics of these countries, you can generally see the trend and the framework of what they're operating under. And it's, the PRC sees itself as, all under heaven, the middle kingdom, the center of the universe. And so it's very clear that that's a lot of what their strategy and what they're working towards is something that satisfies that drive. And it's changing the international environment to better suit Chinese interests, vice, really US interests. Russia is really just looking to continue being a great power. What's a great power? Well, a great power is the country that says it's a great power, the other great powers agree with them. And so as long as Russia stays a great power in the eyes of the international community and enough people in the world, and really in their own eyes, they will generally have met their goals. So that doesn't necessarily mean raising itself up, like I said, but it may just mean being on par with Russia and China in general. Means, they're getting what they want out of this competitive environment.
So would you argue the modern information age is tailor-made? I'm talking cyber operations, info ops via social media, tailor-made to both China's approach to warfare and Russia's and their national interests.
I think
this whole era is tailor-made to their historic approach, projecting power.
I think like any adversary who is an underdog, if you will, they're gonna tailor their strategies to what works best for them. And the information environment, going back to what I was saying, what's the one constraining factor here? It's nuclear weapons. When you really get down to it. So what historically and what have we seen just in the last 30 years doesn't result in escalation of force? Well, it's information operations. Even now, even with some of the major information operations that have been conducted, you don't see militaries moving equipment in response to it, which is hugely powerful because that means you can reach the same end state you're looking for without the threat of complete existential destruction. Because if you don't need to take over a country physically to cause that country to acquiesce to what you want. Not anymore. Previously, borders meant, had a lot of physical, benefits because you couldn't get information across those borders. In the information environment, there are no borders. And so you can use a lot of information capabilities to convince people. That's essentially what we're talking about, is convince people to do something in some manner. And there's stop that information flow. Whereas prior to the modern information environment, there was. And so I think it's really a matter of they've adapted to the modern environment, just out of the nature of the position they were in, really in the last 30 years.
Okay, so let's move on back to the discussion about SOF CA and how it's to be employed. Did a really good job breaking down Russia and China there. In your concluding chapter, you cite the 5 broad domains of the modern competitive environment and 4 primary roles for SOF CA. So how do these roles fit within these domains? And why is SOF CA, in your opinion, uniquely suited to address great power competition according to these defined roles you lay out in your monograph?
Yeah, so the 5 roles I came up with really was determined by what are the mechanisms, the different mechanisms that a nation state can use to apply pressure to an adversary. And so there may be others, but this is really what I found that were in today's modern environment, the 5 that are being used now. And that's population, political warfare, which is the mechanism is people, whether it's populations like as a group or individuals in key positions. It's leveraging those people to get your adversary to do a certain thing. The second one is economic statecraft, and this is applying, a nation state's economic capabilities to create a situation that is beneficial for it. Whether that's trade deals with like the Belt and Road Initiative for the PRC, whether it's monetary policy. The U.S. has a very, very strong ability to apply economic statecraft because the modern liberal world order was built on the dollar. It was built on U.S. policy. And so we have a lot of influence in that international environment. The third is cyber warfare or, computer network operations. And there's a really kind of key point to this is a technical capability. So when we talk about information operations, a lot of times it's conflated with cyber operations. Information operations are population political warfare within this construct I identified. The Russian information operations on the during the 2016 election of all the fake news that was constantly blasted out through Twitter and then reached into the main more modern mainstream news sources and then kind of became a common narrative. That's all political, population political warfare. There's no cyber component of that. Computers and social media was just the method that they disseminated. The cyber component that was related to that, but was very, very separate and was handled separately by 2 different units in the Russian military, was the hack and dump operations of the DNC emails, right? Breaking into a computer system to steal information. That's a cyber operation. Shutting down, an adversary's infrastructure or machinery or some sort of technology. That's a cyber operation. And so it's really important that people understand the difference between the 2 because they're usually conflated just because a lot of times it happens over computers, but that doesn't necessarily make something a cyber operation. The fourth is armed conflict. And especially in the military circles, when you start talking to somebody about great power competition, they think large scale combat operations. And while large scale combat operations is a part of great power competition, it's entirely a feasible strategy to take. It's very unlikely, and it's such a small piece of the broader competitive environment that while you have to plan for it and you have to have resources applied against that potentiality, it's really in the broader construct. It's such a small and such an unlikely event in most cases that it's not necessarily a good thing to get completely wrapped around that as the primary COA. Alternatively, there's state-sponsored insurgencies within an armed conflict. If you were to look at the Cold War, what type of armed conflict really defined the Cold War? The state-sponsored insurgencies, because that avoids escalation. You can have a hybrid of the two, of course. And then finally, the other part of armed conflict is what we refer to as area denial, anti-access area denial, A2AD. And that's not necessarily like actively in conflict, but still part of armed conflict. Anti-ship missile systems in the South China Sea, for example, air defense missile systems, along the Russian border, or in Crimea, for example. These are all parts of armed conflict because they change the calculus of a military action, and that we do see a lot. And then finally, the fifth domain of the modern competitive environment is international institutions themselves. These are those international structures: the UN, NATO, World Bank, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN. All these broad international structures that have, direct and effective ways of getting a foreign adversary to do certain things. If in, the UN, especially within the Security Council, like those votes and those decisions have a lot of power over other countries. And so competition within this environment cannot be ignored. Within the roles of SOF CA, that's the one environment, the one domain that SOF CA doesn't have a very large role, because that's a realm we don't really operate in. So I really didn't spend a lot of time on it in the monograph. But within population political warfare, all four: initial entry, reconnaissance, engage in influence, and support resistance. And that makes sense. That's really our bread and butter as a military capability, is with that population. So of course, like all of our roles are going to apply there. Within economic statecraft, the two primary roles are the reconnaissance one, initial entry and reconnaissance, right? It's understanding, there's a new construction project starting up in this area. Okay, knowing that that's happening can inform decisions and inform the campaign against an adversary. Maintaining tabs of understanding of maybe the effect that certain economic policies are having in a population, having that information, being communicated up, and being directed to find that information, not just being out there and coming across it. That can drive decision makers. Potentially within the domain of economic statecraft, you can leverage SOF CA for engage in influence and support to resistance. And that's this undermining piece of, through completely legitimate methods, incurring costs upon an adversary, whether it's bringing to light, mistakes or missteps that the adversary is making, whether it's, a third-party translation of contracts. Any of these mechanisms can incur costs on an adversary. Within cyber warfare, really it's the reconnaissance piece, initial entry and reconnaissance, understanding what is happening to a key or target population. And then armed conflict, once again, all four roles really apply. Initial entry into countries to help set the theater, reconnaissance of, for example, key populations that are at risk, or certain roads and the capacities of those roads, capacity of bridges, as we're traveling around countries, coordinating with host nation transportation services and logistics, and then engage in influence really is probably the mobilizing, maybe countering and inoculating a population from an adversary's information operations, but also mobilizing that population to really build into that resistance piece for the support for resistance, whether it's to deter, undermine, or resist an enemy occupation.
All right, so we got one last question. At the end of the monograph, you provide some rather specific recommendations to revise current SOF CA doctrine, organization, training, and equipment, And you've addressed a little bit of this in previous questions, to meet mission requirements and address capability gaps in the realm of great power competition. So just summarize his recommendations for us and discuss any reception that you've received from the SOF enterprise.
So yeah, I really broke down the recommendations. Once again, this goes into that plane in flight analogy. You know, now we have kind of an understanding of what we have, the environment we need to apply it in. What do we need to change to be better at applying it in that environment? So from a doctrinal standpoint, it's having a specific SOF CA doctrine. The latest FM 3-57 at least acknowledges the different missions and the different ways in which SOF CA is applied from conventional CA, but it doesn't go much beyond that. And so really it's separating that doctrine so we have a good foundation of the operations, the missions, and the training that we need to do. Another part of that is the analytics piece. We're dealing with large populations, human networks, social networks, and we really need to work on and really develop out that analytical structure and methodology. The 95th CA Brigade is making leaps and bounds on this, and really digging in and figuring out how do we do this? What's the best way to analyze the information we have in order to understand the effects we're having, and then drive operations. The second piece goes into the organization, which is the big recommendation I make here is the size of our team. So a 4-person team has a lot of benefits when it comes to political risk, but has a lot of downsides when it comes to risk to the force itself. A 4-person team has a very hard time getting around in any sort of denied or non-permissive environment. And along with that, have a very hard time of really applying a lot of resources to, even just mental resources to planning and preparation and those type of processes. And so it's expanding that team a little bit. My recommendation was 6-person team, increasing the rank of the team sergeant so you have a lot more experience on the team level, and then adding a little bit more, some specialty MOSs on that team. Third piece is training, and this kind of goes back to the doctrine, right? It's doctrine drives training. It's training the methodology to analyze networks to everybody. A lot of this is still kind of held at almost a master's level, but we need to really institutionalize it, bring it back down so that every NCO and every officer in the force knows how to do this analytics. Additionally, the potential for specialty skills, right? We operate in some unique environments, but we don't have a maritime team, for example. Yet we have teams operating in, the South Pacific, South China Sea, in island nations. Probably need some maritime skills. You don't necessarily need to be able to infill via scuba tanks and rebreathers, but you probably need to understand how to handle boats on water. How to be able to swim pretty well. Things like that. Teams operating up near mountains and high altitude. If we're lucky, we'll be able to train up for that prior to a mission, but that's not institutionalized. And then finally, the equipment piece. Like I said before, we're not defined by our equipment when it comes to the capabilities, but there still is some specialty equipment that we need, and we need more than what we have. A big piece is communications. We can't communicate. We can't. It doesn't matter what we're doing really, because nobody else is building upon it. We have decent communication systems now, but that's the one thing everybody struggles with. The other piece really is going back to the specialty skills, specialty teams, is that specialty equipment. Teams operating near water probably need boats. Whether it's Zodiac, ribs. Teams operating, in mountainous environments probably need mountain equipment. That sort of equipping in an institutional sense to the teams that are designated to hold those skills.
So we have a question from our audience. that ties in with what we're discussing here, this last question. How about integration of civil affairs into Army SOF or other component tactical units?
So that is a big discussion point. The big push now, is the cross-functional teams within RSOF, which is where you take a CA team, an SFODA, and a PSYOP TPT, or some similar organization, put them together into one team to create broader effects. If the environment applies, then absolutely, right? If you, we see it now in areas that are more denied or less permissive, a 4-person team can't get around the battlefield, for example. They need a plus up on, from like an ODA, for example, just for the basic security, for the knowledge of how to maneuver in that area. And also a lot of times in those cases, they're dealing with more security oriented problem sets, which is a lot more the realm of an ODA. The TPT, the PSYOP element is huge. And, and putting all that capability together on a single team, gives them a much broader way to affect the environment they're in. The downside of this and the point of caution, I always bring up when we're talking about integrating, is, do we mean integrating for the specific discrete time and purpose of a mission? Or are we talking about like just mashing everything together because we don't want to really learn, the different capabilities of the different organizations? Because when you integrate at a team, it's like a task force where you take one company from over here, one company from over here, put them under an O5, and you got a task force now. That's fine for discrete units. But when you're talking at the team level, it becomes much more personality based. And so you have to integrate the right way. You have to train together early. You have to identify, go through the whole team building stage, because it's all individuals, not so much units that are kind of off on their own and just commanders reporting and coordinating. And so you run the risk. It's high reward when it works, but you really got to look at, is that situation when you need an integrated team, or do you just need a couple of teams working their lines of effort and they're naturally going to coordinate? If you put them in the same building, they're gonna coordinate, especially at the team level, the ODA level, the TPT level. Give them their tasks, like they're going to cross coordinate and figure out what works. So while it works when it works, the risk involved with the idea of CFTs, you really got to manage it and make sure you're doing it in the right way.
So what about this? Readily applies to SEAL platoons and MARSOC Raider units as well, correct? The CA pieces is critical with integration.
Yep, and it does. And so, if the mission, it comes down to, what's the mission? And do you need to integrate a team, or do you just need a capability, aligned under a company? A company level asset or a SOTF level asset, for example. What is it you're trying to get at? A lot of people just think CFT, just go and do it. Well, you may not need that. You may want an independent CA team or an independent ODA or an independent TPT, running support at the company level, or supporting a broader area potentially, or maybe just working one line of effort, because that's what you need in that area. And so to me, it's the same thing as a task force. You task organize for the mission you have, and if you're going to task organize, that's the level of integration. If you're going to do it, you need to do it the right way, which is putting them together early, training together, learning each other's capabilities, learning each other's TTPs, and having a very
All right. Well, I think we have adequately addressed the subject, and given the lateness of the hour, Travis, we're going to let you get some sleep, get ready for the duty day tomorrow. So thanks for joining us, and congratulations again on the publication of your monograph. And we wish you all the best for the duration of your deployment. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Kerry. It's been fun. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Okay, we'll get some sleep. So your research and your findings, Travis, are very timely, given the ongoing debate here at SOCOM over transitioning the SOF enterprise to the new era of GCP. GPC, excuse me. And I'd like to remind the audience, if you found our discussion enlightening, I encourage you to look at our curriculum and course dates at the JSOU public webpage at socom.mil/JSOU and click on courses. Also, take the time to explore JSOU press publications on this and similar topics. For feedback on Think JSOU or to nominate potential speakers, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. This series is brought to you by the Strategic Studies Department of the Joint Special Operations University. Thank you all for listening.